Hello and welcome to the first Open Analytics broadcast. My name is Scott Raspa and I'm one of the co-organizers of the Open Analytics events, which include meetups, summits, and now broadcasts. And I'm also your host for today. Open Analytics broadcasts are a new type of event that we're hosting where I'll be having open source and data analytical conversations with a variety of guests from many different industries and backgrounds. We're really excited to have two guests on our show today, Will LaForest with MongoDB and Chelsey Campbell with nCONTEXT. I'll be talking to them about open source technologies, the big data ecosystem, best practices, and much more. Our first guest today is Will LaForest with MongoDB. MongoDB is reinventing data management and powering big data as a leading NoSQL database. They're in the news on a regular basis. I'm sure you've read or heard about them, and they've recently raised a new Series F round of $150 million, bringing their total funding to $230 million to date. I'm going to talk to Will a little bit more about how they're utilizing these funds in just a moment. Will leads the federal practice at MongoDB and is focused on evangelizing MongoDB and solving big data challenges within the federal government. He has a long history of solving extreme data issues within the government and commercial space. And prior to MongoDB, he was a principal technologist with MarkLogic. Will, thanks for joining the show.
Thank you.
So I just mentioned MongoDB, they've raised a lot of funds to date. Can you tell us a little bit more about how these funds are being utilized?
Yeah, that last round, 150 million, is pretty crazy.
Yeah.
It's not something you see every day. In fact, I think that now makes it the largest single round funding for any database ever in history.
Oh.
So that speaks volumes to market potential, obviously. I think, of the 150 million, I would say the vast majority of it is actually being put back into the product, which is, I'm sure, what the community would hope.
Yeah.
The interesting thing, I think, of the money that's going towards the engineering and reinvesting in the product, a good chunk of that is probably going towards a process that we already started a couple of releases ago, which is really around maturing the security picture, right? So features we've added in the past, things like Kerberos and FIPS 140-2 compliant SSL and better management software and better auditing, things that maybe if I'm a web developer is not so sexy, but if I'm in a large enterprise, if I'm in the government, I have PI information is really, really important.
Sure.
And that just reflects our adoption in the enterprise space as well. So.
Yeah, that's awesome. So you're a leading open source NoSQL database. Why is open source so important to you all?
Well, there's all the usual benefits with open source, right? There's obviously, from a customer's perspective, there's risk mitigation, the ability to essentially try things and build things, and then come to a trusted vendor when you actually need the support and expertise required. Obviously, adoption is huge, right? If you're opening up a new market, it's important. But I think the really important thing about open source to MongoDB and really the entire big data space is that fundamentally, and I like to say, it's great MongoDB can scale to thousands of servers, right? But, aside from your technology scaling, the business model has to scale too, right? I think gone are the days that big data, a database company has 1,000 nodes for a big data situation can charge 6 figures per server. It just doesn't work anymore. It's kind of interesting if you track license cost versus hardware cost. There was a time and they were sort of on parity, or maybe it was like $1 million for a hardware box and your database software cost, 6 figures. And then we got to a point where it was about equal, and then by the time we got to the 90s, it was like $40,000 machines, and yet the software was still like 6 figures. And now Blades for a database is like 20K, right? And it's just not proportional. So it really needs to be proportional to the value of the hardware that you're using to scale for your big data solutions.
Awesome. Well, can you share any cool use cases that you guys may have been up to so we can learn more about what you can do with MongoDB?
Yeah, a lot of exciting stuff going on. One that I'm personally really pumped about is this effort that we're doing right now around data as a service, and specifically targeted towards the open data platform, which will support Obama's executive order around exposing machine readable data. And we feel like we've come up with sort of a recipe for a fantastic platform with a combination of partners, which includes, for instance, Red Hat's OpenShift, which is a PaaS platform, which allows you to essentially do one-line platform deployment. An open source app server, could be JBoss, could be Tomcat, and of course MongoDB. Because MongoDB's dynamic schema, the knock-on effect is it means when I'm putting my data in, it doesn't have to be told ahead of time what the data looks like. You know that, right? And it's one of the foundations of the work that you guys do. And then fundamentally, half the time you don't know how much data you're going to put in your platform. So it needs to be able to incrementally add capacity. So MongoDB was the perfect fit for this data as a service platform and open data. And then finally, one of our customers and a fantastic bureau in the government, one of my favorites, CFPB, Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, they sort of have a mandate in the open source that everything they build that can be open sourced, they will open source. And one of those projects is called QU. And it was created for them specifically to target their open data requirements. What we've started doing is working with them and getting other people in the community to participate and add their time and create a more it's already a a platform that can be repurposed, but extending the capabilities so that all the other government agencies can benefit from this. And so whereas in a live demo, where I have plenty of time, I might go through the steps. But what's really, really cool is in a period of literally like 5 minutes, I can go from nothing to data hosted, querying, and accessible to on a network, right? And if you look here, I have an example in the first line of using essentially OpenShift to deploy the entire platform. And this includes, for instance, the VM, so essentially the hardware, if you will. It includes the app server. It includes the database. It includes QU. It includes configuring. And with one line, in a minute's time, I can have the entire platform up and going and accessible. And then, that could be on a public cloud. It could be on a private cloud. It could even be on your own machine, right? So super powerful. We've built essentially a data loader which allows you to point to XML or JSON. And remember, MongoDB doesn't need to know what that looks like ahead of time. It'll just slurp that up and make it accessible. So really, without knowing anything about the data, anything about having to set up the infrastructure, you can go to a platform that I'm going to show you right now, which is really, really powerful. If you look at this, this may not look sexy to you folks, but if you're a machine reading JSON, this is sexy. Essentially, this is a web interface to the RESTful services that serve up data that's in this platform. In this case, the census data that I loaded up in the previous slide. And the notion here is now I can start slicing and dicing my data and running, essentially finding sort of ad hoc parameters to display my data. So here's a human-readable view, right? But from the same platform, right? For instance, if I'm a service, I'm probably not going to want it in HTML. I'm going to want it in JSON, right? So you might want to view it in JSON or XML. And fundamentally, the other thing you can do is you can start running aggregates and stuff on the data in there. So if I'm a user and I'm consuming your data, I may not want just at this level. Perhaps I'm only interested in males. And I want basically a summarization of the population based upon state. Let's see, 2010 state. And now, using this sort of SQL-like syntax, it can start querying and aggregating the data that I knew nothing about literally 5 minutes ago. I mean, how cool is that? So, if you're an organization that has to spell dimensions correctly, this is really powerful because I can start exposing my data to the public and it can get real use by data scientists and other people that are building services on it. So, very exciting stuff.
Yeah, that's awesome. So it sounds like nowadays everybody's getting involved in big data. Everybody claims that they do big data to some capacity. Can you kind of give us your take on the big data ecosystem and maybe where it's headed?
Yeah, I mean, obviously the term big data gets bandied around a lot for good reason. It's kind of a strange title because really, what considered big data, the 3 Vs, two of them don't have anything to do with big.
Yeah.
It's a sort of convenient title. I like to call it awkward data, right? But obviously I wouldn't have got a job with Gartner.
Yeah.
But I think there's this ecosystem building around it, and I think in 5 years we won't be talking about big data. We're just going to be talking about data, I think the reason why they get grouped together now is because they're all three V's, if you will, the big data, are all things that are challenging for traditional data stack to tackle. But now that we're seeing the maturity in operational stores like MongoDB and Hadoop, tools, the ecosystem, if you will, can start leveraging them, and we're seeing more and more adoption of these. So I think this distinction the big data ecosystem, it's going to be less about the big data ecosystem and more about having the right tool for the right problem, right? Sure. Modern data, essentially, right? Relational, the tabular data that COD was working with in the 70s is only a small fraction of the total data, as you know, right? So it's exciting times, and it's just going to grow and grow, really.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, thank you very much for your time. This is really interesting stuff, and appreciate it. So check out MongoDB for more information. Our next guest is Chelsey Campbell with nCONTEXT by Sierra Nevada Corporation, which is a software engineering and data analysis organization focused on solving complex problems to enable better decision making. Chelsey is a data scientist at nCONTEXT and is focused on open source and social media analytics. She spends her day scouring the internet for new data sources to pull into the nCONTEXT analytical environment, analyzing the data to find insights that can enable leaders to make decisions, and creating models for properly characterizing risks and threats for nCONTEXT clients. Chelsey, thanks for joining the broadcast.
Thanks for having me.
So you spend a lot of your time with open source data. Can you tell us or share some best practices that you may have learned over all these years of looking at this type of data?
Sure. I would say there's kind of two really important aspects. One is open source intelligence, and that's knowing what is out there, what exists on the open source internet for the most part. And then the second piece is actually doing the open source analysis or the data analysis, finding what open source data is actually valuable and can play a role in doing the analysis. But usually we approach problems, regardless of the domain, regardless of what question you're trying to answer, the same way. So number one, what decisions are you trying to make? And number two, what data do you have that already exists? And then the third part is really where our expertise comes in, and we know what kind of data that already exists that's out there that's kind of non-traditional, and maybe you haven't applied it to your problem yet, but really we could find some valuable insights there if we apply it to your data and your domain. And so kind of putting that all together really we have found is the right way to approach a problem. But really, aside from that, channeling that way of approaching it, I would say some other best practices are figuring out how to find the insights in the data. So in order to do that, we kind of cast out this large net. So, if we're looking at healthcare, we're looking at risk characterization. Let's do an overall analysis of what exists. And then we can start to figure out, okay, if we're looking at a local area, are there local newspapers that we want to bring in? Because they might be telling about some patterns in the society that are right there. So we want to bring that in. So it's really casting that open net and then bringing in some more specific data sources, which is really going to deliver your insight in this huge world of big data.
Sure,
right?
Sure. So what type of technologies are you using along with this data?
Yeah, so I think the really important part is figuring out those key technologies to use, having the right tools and the right data. So we were working with a number of partners. We're working with Iconow, which is really, they're developing our analytics platform with us. We're kind of taking it from the developer platform that it is right now and allowing analysts to actually perform on it. So data scientists and our open source Intel analysts to actually pull insights and deliver reports to customers. We're also, we pull some data feeds into that platform. So we're looking at DataMine, FactSet, Hoovers, your traditional kind of relational type data that they've set up, and then bringing that in with the Twitter hose and the Facebook and Google+. And so bringing all of that in is really important and in the overall scheme of things.
Yeah, no, that's very interesting. So can you share any examples of any cool use cases that you might have been working on recently?
Yeah, so I would say, over the past few years, there's a lot of topics that have come up, and what do we want to analyze today? But I would say the common thread has been about risk characterization. So no matter what domain you're in, I've talked a little bit about healthcare, or if you're in supply chain, or if you're in emergency management, this whole concept of risk characterization. has been really important. And now with Twitter and social media, we see that we have sensors on the ground that we don't have to pay for or acquire. They're already existing, so we want to make sure we pull that in and take advantage, and that can really help characterize risk. Or if we're looking at United Nations data or maybe Bureau of Labor statistics when it comes to supply chain and maybe looking at human trafficking risk in your supply chain, or maybe counterfeiting, so you want to look at importing and exporting data, import and export data. So what I want to show is a little bit about risk characterization.
Okay.
So the first part you have is you want to characterize the risk. What are your risks? And then the second piece is, now that I've characterized my risk, what do I actually do about it? So the piece that I want to show is that second piece. What do we actually do with the data? So right here is our analytics platform. The specific case that we're looking at is Hurricane Sandy data. So, we knew where it was going to hit. We knew what was the risky areas, right? So how do you get prepared for that? What we did, we worked with an insurance company actually to figure out how could they have better responded to Sandy in terms of deploying their resources better, because on hand they have a staff that can respond to crisis. But they needed exponentially more staff that could respond. So you're looking at really experienced responders to not so experienced responders. Well, where are your experienced responders? Are they where the hardest hit locations are? Or do you need to reallocate your resources? So that was one of the parts that we did. So that took their data, where their responders were. That took their data in terms of where are their actual customers, their what assets do they have out there. But then it also, which was really important, was the social media, because those were our sensors on the ground. So even though you might be a customer of Allstate or Progressive, but you're not necessarily tweeting, hey, the power's out or my house is damaged. But we know where you are, and there are some tweets that are geolocated, and we can see, okay, look, some people down here are actually tweeting that they don't have any power. So right here, water going down, they need to send help ASAP. So we go and see, okay, is there anyone, if we put in a KML layer here, do we have any of our customers that are in that area? So then, that second kind of layer on there, you can start to see, okay, well, where are shelters? Where are agents? Maybe are my level 1 agents? And then you can start to say, okay, well, let me reach out to these households, because these are where we're getting a lot of tweets on my query up here. And I put a query in that's looking for flood, damage, fire, help. So I know that there's a lot of those tweets or Facebook posts right here. So I know that maybe these guys are really impacted. So I want to look at how can I improve my customer service. So who should I deploy there? How can I reach out to them and say, hey, come to this shelter. There's a lot of food, food and water and supplies. So actually, during the time, Google had something that they were starting on Google Maps, where they had actually the shelters. So you could go and look for where are the shelters. So we incorporated that in here so they could really start to improve. So here you see I have shelters kind of selected. So right here we have our ones, and that's where I was going to. Those are our people that are not as advanced in terms of helping with the response. Actually, I would say one is probably they're the most experienced, but we have our level 2 and our level 3, which aren't. And so you can start to see, are they allocated in the right areas? And so kind of what came of that is, okay, look, we could have done a much better job here. We looked at were there hashtags that they could have had, because some people had hashtags and phone numbers that they were including in there that were really helpful, and people were kind of conglomerating around that. So could they have done that?
Sure.
And the answer was yes, absolutely. People were monitoring this, but it's taking that next level of incorporating your own organizational data with the open source data that's out there, merging so you can make those correlations, those insights, putting your data in context.
Sure. And so what type of outcomes would you expect, or should your clients expect from something like this?
Right. So that one, it was, okay, now we know how to better allocate our resources. We know how to better serve our customers. We knew where to respond first, because these houses were the most damaged or had the most power outage. But we've also looked at, in another scenario, if we're looking at a supply chain, right? So if you take a huge supply chain company, like a grocery chain that has tier 6 and 7 suppliers, they're sourcing hundreds of thousands of products. How do you determine your riskier suppliers? And so what we did there was we brought in data that looked at if you were sourcing a product, products that were maybe prone to human trafficking or forced labor. Then we took some United Nations data and we looked at, okay, based on these countries, human trafficking is not necessarily, is kind of tolerated there. So if we correlate that on top, and then we can look at the suppliers, and the suppliers are sourcing from those countries, we can say, hey, you should take a look, dive deeper here. So instead of looking at 5,000 suppliers, you can now focus on a few hundred and then ask them questions, dig deeper, do an on-site survey. So it becomes manageable. Your problem becomes manageable,
Sure.
which I think is the big thing. We all know there's so much data out there. Well, what data do you actually need to make a decision from?
Sure.
So that's what we're really all about, especially with this platform, and our use cases have been supporting that.
That's fantastic. That's really interesting. So thank you very much for joining. And if you would like to learn more about Chelsey's company, nCONTEXT, visit their website at ncontext.com. So that concludes our broadcast for today. I'd like to thank our sponsors, Think Big Analytics, the University of Virginia's Master's Degree in System Engineering, Avechka, and Eichenau for helping make this possible. Before I leave, I'd also like to mention that we have set a date and time for our next Open Analytics Summit, which will be taking place in Chicago on March 27th in 2014. So if you're interested in attending, speaking, sponsoring, please visit the website for more information, which is openanalyticssummit.com. So that concludes our show. Thanks for viewing.